All right. The New Testament Code by Robert Eisenman. It's a book of over 1,000 pages, not including the endnotes. This book is probably the hardest book that was ever written to read, except maybe the phone book. But I would almost venture to say there are as many characters in this book as there are in the phone book of a small town. And when I started reading Eisenman back in probably about 90, 88, something like that, I realized that I would read through a chapter and I would get nothing out of it. Why? Because I didn't know the characters or the literature that he was talking about. So what I did was I collected the literature myself. This is before the internet, so it was difficult to find some of the stuff, but in the process of finding it, I did find the Nazarene Acts, which at that time was very difficult to find. You couldn't get it but in a rare books library or something like that, or if you bought a set of Apostolic Fathers. Begin to study this literature and study the history as well. That's the second thing. There's not much more history we have from this time besides Josephus and a little bit of Tacitus or Tacitus, the Roman historian. That's really good. Both Josephus and Tacitus, they read almost novelistically. They're very, very interesting. As well as for the emperors is Suetonius, the Nine Caesars, I think is the name of the book. Suetonius really digs deep for gossip on these emperors and tells us without, well, I should say unabashedly, what these emperors were known for. The Roman Empire and Israel are very, very much connected. We remember that Israel was under Lives of the 12 Caesars. Thank you. You know everything. Very connected in that the Roman Empire, especially its higher class people, were Greekophiles, Hellenists. They admired Greece, their history, their philosophy so much that the Roman Empire at its head aped or tried to be what Greece was in a little different way. Greece and their empires had pretty much dwindled by the time of Roman power. And Greece, you remember, had taken over Palestine somewhere around 300 BC. And it kept Palestine as a colony to about, I think, 60 BC, long time, 240 years or more. And in that time, the philosophy of the Greeks was to assimilate, just like the Borg collective. Assimilate. Alexander the Great went through the world in a very short time and conquered it, including the Persian Empire. And his means of assimilating was very simple. Either you become Greeks or you die. One thing or the other, including in Palestine. There was no quarter for Jews. We read a little about it in the Maccabees later on. But the whole idea behind Greece, and then later the Greek Empire called the Seleucid Empire, that included Syria, their leaders were very interested in consolidating their property as Hellenistic Greek people. And so people are pretty astounded when I say that in the first century, the time of Yahshua, the Romans had taken over by this time, of course, and Roman infiltration was very similar to Greek infiltration. They're surprised when I say that probably undoubtedly the majority of people in Galilee spoke Greek. That was the main language. We even see that in the disciples of Yahshua. We've got Peter, Andrew, Philip, maybe a few more. They've got Greek names and probably were Hellenists that wanted to get back to their Hebrew roots again. Now, we had Hellenistic Jews that didn't worship Yahweh except in a very light way. They worshiped Greek gods. They spoke Greek. They read Greek literature, those that could read. And this was what was expected of them. Then, when Rome came in, it was the same thing with them. You can speak Greek because the Romans all spoke Greek. Pilate spoke Greek, even though his main language was Latin. That was part of your instruction growing up, was in the Greek language throughout the Roman Empire, most of which had belonged to Greece before that anyway. So that was the lingua franca of the day, and maybe Judea was the exception. They probably still spoke Hebrew to some extent, Aramaic, but Greek was, because it was the international language, if you wanted to do business, you had to speak Greek or Latin. It always made me wonder when Yahshua stands before Pilate, or he stands before the Herodians, what language they spoke in. Certainly, governors of Syria. Syria was part of the Greek Empire and then the Roman Empire, and Syria had the capital at, Ctesiphon was the name of the town, of Palestine. And certainly the government officials all spoke Greek, as did the telones, the tax farmers, like one we talk about from the New Testament named Matityahu, a man with a very Hebrew name who collected taxes, probably for Rome. These guys had a horrible reputation for gaining from the people up and above what the tax was, because that's how they got paid. And they were relentlessly punished by Greece and then later Rome if they didn't get their taxes in. So we see this picture of Matityahu and Yahshua sitting at the table with tax collectors and sinners. Tax collectors were the lowest form of life that there was at that time. Indeed, telones really means tax farmers rather than tax collectors. Don't get them confused with the IRS today. I mean, the IRS will get you eventually, but they won't flog you at any rate. They'll throw you in jail. Eisenman begins his preface in order to do some defining of where he's coming from, primarily in names and places. So I'm going to go through as much of the preface as I can at this time, because if you don't have down pretty much the basic teachings of the preface, you're going to have a very hard time through the book. Eisenman points out the discovery. By the way, if you have something to say, unmute your mic and say it. That will be fine. Or click the button that says raise your hand. Eisenman starts out with the discovery of the Gospel of Judas, saying that this gospel points to a later evolutionary development in gospel writing, an evolution of the canonical gospel literature. And not only that, but especially the writings of Paul. And Paul's gospels, we believing that the canonical gospels had been rewritten by Pauline forces, and Paul himself has a gospel of Jesus Christ, Jesus Christos, that is in quite a bit of contradiction. to what we would imagine the historical Jesus would be like. Paul's is a spiritual Jesus. Paul talks very little about Jesus' actual biography. He mentions Jesus' brothers, or the brothers of the Lord, as he says, but the only historical information we get from him, except the name Jesus Christos, is that he was crucified. And even Pilate isn't mentioned in that. He's crucified, and he becomes, through the crucifixion, a redeemed man, a spiritual being that's able to ascend and descend at will. The Gospel of Judas points to almost a fullness of the evolution of those Gospels. I'll tell you a little bit about it. Take the Gospel of John, for instance, extremely anti-Semitic. Understand that I'm not talking from, I can compartmentalize. I'm not talking from a faith perspective. I'm talking from a historical critical perspective at this point. My faith doesn't have anything to do with explaining Eisenman's work, believe me. I think probably people of great faith that can't compartmentalize are going to have a very difficult time with this book. So we have an evolution that Eisenman points out of anti-Semitism toward what was called in ancient times Gnosticism, and in the Gospel of Judas, fully developed Gnosticism. This comes from a reading of the canonical Gospels in regards to this Judas Iscariot. We understand that Iscariot means the assassin man, the Sakari of the first century, especially late first century AD, were assassins, murderers. You probably already know this. They carried a little bit of a sickle-shaped knife in which they would sneak up behind Roman officials and temple employees and cut their throats in crowds and then walk away. Or if they heard somebody speaking about the Torah, they would force them to be circumcised right then and there. That was it, or they would kill them. Now, Judas Iscariot, Yehuda Ishkariot, I got to tell you one thing. My name is a European offspring of Kariot. My name's Snyder. Kariot means cutter, and so does my name in German or Yiddish. That's a little bit scary. Maybe I'm of the blood of Judas, but that's a theological issue that we can take up sometime. And my redemption cometh nigh. The antagonist in the Gospel of John, who is selling out the Messiah for a certain amount of money and ends up throwing the money down at the temple steps. And further on in the Gospel of Luke, he hangs himself and his guts fall out. It's kind of cool to read the other accounts of what happened to Judas. One of the early Nazarenes of the late first century talks about Judas living on and swelling up. He got swelled up so bad that a chariot hit him, and he exploded where the chariot hit him. And this guy writes that even in his day, nobody goes around that alley anymore because it smells so bad. That's an interesting end to Judas Sakari. And we have another source that tells us that Judas ended up in Helvetia. And he died up in Helvetia, that's Switzerland, and can't get into how he got up there, but that's another legend that comes from Judas Iscariot. If he was even historical, most consider him a fictional stand-in for the Jewish nation and for the contempt that the gospel redactors heaped upon the Jews. He stands for the whole Jewish nation as the protagonist in the Gospels and the murderer of the Messiah. But consider this Judas to be a stand-in for the entire nation of Jews, portrayed as the assassin. The whole Jewish world in the gospel, according to this view, is found in the reprehensible acts of Judas Iscariot, his greed, his money grubbing, his love of unrighteous mammon. By the time we get to the Gospel of Judas, he is elevated. He's no longer simply a Jew. He's the greatest of the Jews. And not only is the greatest of the Jews, that he's able to exit Judaism altogether because he has the secret knowledge. He's the purveyor of gnosis in the Gospel of Judas, and thus transcends the whole Jewish nation that he represented in the canonical Gospels. No Jews could come close to him. Even the holy ones of the canonical Gospels, that is, the disciples, they could never attain to the place where Judas attained. Thus, Judas is no longer a part of the Jewish world in the Gospel of Judas, but as the assassin of Jesus, become more than a man himself. He becomes the redeemer of Jesus, causing the redemption of Jesus by assassinating him in this Gnostic kind of thinking. A good Gnostic who had attained to the secret knowledge in order to go up to the highest heaven and be able to encounter the archons, that is, evil angels that were against him, and answer questions that they might pose to him, and going from one archon to the other as he ascends up, fulfill the mysteries of Gnosis and end up in the pleroma, the great place of the dwelling of the Most High, indescribable God of light and love. So in Gnosticism, you've got to understand that one with a secret knowledge can only begin his journey up when wretched Windows update, when he is murdered, when he's martyred. So he martyrs Jesus in order to redeem him. That's a good thing. And Judas, in the Gospel of Judas, is awaiting to be martyred, thus redeemed himself by the disciples. He has a dream. A lot is missing from the Gospel of Judas, but we got enough to see that his dream is, his redemption is nigh, because the other disciples, who could never attain to this kind of knowledge, these ignorant, sinful disciples, are going to stone him. And indeed, that is, we reckon, how Judas ascends, by the stoning of the disciples, leading to his death, leading to his rising. So he is, in the Gospel of Judas, awaiting his own redemption at the hands of these chosen Jews that John considers chosen in his Gospel, that is, the disciples. We see something a little different in Mark. Mark always shows the disciples as ignorant cowards, afraid. In fact, the Gospel of Mark ends up in 16:8. And they were afraid. We go to now a little different vignette, that is, the Platonists or Platonists, those that followed the philosophies of Plato. Plato was the teacher of Socrates. Socrates was the student. Try it again. Plato was the teacher of Socrates. Socrates was the teacher of Aristotle. Aristotle was the teacher of Alexander of Macedon, that is, Alexander the Great. Plato never really wrote anything. What was written was by Socrates, who wrote down the teachings of Plato. And then we have the greatest of them all, Aristotle. You remember what happened to Socrates? Socrates and his wife, Xantippe. X-A-N, Xantippe. Well, Socrates ended up getting an ultimatum that he could make a choice as to the ultimatum, and he had to redeem himself. He had to kill himself. So he commits hara-kiri and leaves Aristotle behind. Aristotle wrote all kinds of works of philosophy, religion, geography, history, all kinds of stuff that was lost to us until the Muslims, I should say, till Islam was able to conquer that area of the world. And at that time, Islam was very open to learnings, and they took the works of Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, and they translated them into Arabic, from which they were translated into Latin, and thus got into the hands of the church fathers of, let me see, about the 12th century, I believe, especially St. Thomas Aquinas. And we talk about Constantine perverting Christianity. Well, what Constantine did was just a drop in the bucket compared to Aquinas. And these people of the Catholic faith at that time took Aristotle and made him a proto-evangelist, that before Jesus came along, Aristotle had the news on Jesus and projected that news. And unfortunately, that's why we in the church today have the teachings of body, soul, and spirit, heaven and hell, and many other ones. In the first century, we have Platonists that were incorporated in Judaism. You got to know that if so many in Palestine spoke Greek, even more in Egypt, because Egypt was another protectorate of Greece called the Ptolemaic Empire, starting with a P. And we have there Philo and his counterpart in Israel, whose name was Paul. Paul and Philo. And we might throw Josephus into the bunch too, because Josephus became a lover of Latin and scion of royalty, the Roman Empire. All of those would consider the story of Judas not history, but literature, and specifically allegory, or in the case of Philo, enigma. That the historical part could only be read in between the lines, especially in the case of Philo, using a certain code that Philo created in order to find what's behind the text, the real historical meaning behind the stories that were in texts like the Gospels. I did a couple teachings on the Philoan enigmas to show you in one case how Philo would have worked to interpret gospel passages in a historical way rather than just as they're read. Those are out at jspresents.org, or I believe that I have them linked in the link that I sent out there. I'll see if it's still out there on chat. Yes, you'll find a link out there, jacksonsnyder.com/New Testament Code Preface.doc. That's links to everybody I'm mentioning here, if you want to go out and look there. The Philoan Enigma's way of interpreting allegories, and as you can see from the Gospels themselves, they are very much novelized, especially John, and especially Acts and Luke, more than the rest. Got to be reading between the lines, got to understand the name games that they have, the other historical games, again, as I said before a number of times, that authors of such literature, when they wrote about criminals like the Messianic dynasty, they chanced being arrested and executed, because the Roman law at that time was, you write about these guys, you get caught, you get the same punishment as they do. Now, these accounts of the Gospels are considered to be literature to them. One of our speeches by Robert Eisenman that I have out there on the download site addresses in almost genius fashion the difference between literature and history. Literature will win the hearts and minds of people. History will never do that. So I have so much trouble when we talk about Revelation as history, because speculative, novelistic literature interpretations of Revelation are certainly more affecting the mind than the historical facts of the situation. Therefore, we don't know how we would ever overcome the, should I say, brainwashing of people through the Christian church as to the proclamation of the revelation of John. Literature wins hearts and minds, not history. Professor Eisenman seems to be a master of applying the methodology of Philo and others. Look at the name of the book, New Testament Code, to get to some startling truths or speculations behind that ancient literature. Let me find my next page here. Paul, on the other hand, exemplifies his philosophical underpinnings, especially in Galatians 4:24. I'm sure you all know what that passage has to say. It compares the Tanakh, or maybe more appropriately, the Torah, to Hagar, which is an extremely derogatory, anti-Jewish synthesis, very anti-Semitic, demonstrative. It shows Paul's method of integrating allegorically. But for Paul, his allegory is to be interpreted by you as history and truth, because in his mind, it is truth. Galatians is certainly the most revealing document of all those considered to be sacred. Galatians 4:24. Now, Philo, on the other hand, would have interpreted this in the framework of Egypt rather than Palestine or Hellenism. Now, Egypt was Hellenistic, but it was of a little different brand there. The interpretation that Philo would have done concerning Messiah or even Judas Iscariot would be in the framework of Egyptian God-man stories, men that became gods or men that ascended. And today we have something called ascended masters in certain movements, that the ascended masters who were men come back down to give people messages like the Essene Gospel of Peace, like the Gospel of the Holy 12, totally channeled from dead people, or, if you please, spirits of the ascended masters. What affected the church so much was the philosopher theologian called, I got him down on my paper there, Anselm. Why the God-Man is the name of his essay, something we were encouraged to read in the university in regards to religious study and the nature of Christ. Why the God-Man? So I've got a link to that wiki page where it'll give you a link to the essay. It's certainly worth reading. I would say most Christians would agree with it. I doubt that you would. In Egypt was full of God-man stories that are exemplified in the Coptic gospel literature. Unlike the Hebrew Bible, where the framework is different, in which God has interests in the doings of humankind, and the deity itself is moving in a spiritual way to help people or hinder people. The Egyptian way is that God becomes a human being, or gods become human-like beings. Consider the kingdom days of Egypt and look at some of the Egyptian gods like Thoth, who some say is still speaking today, every kind of heresy, and people are believing it. They are in human form with some kind of an animal head or wings to portray themselves as those who are able to ascend and descend. This is not part of the Hebrew understanding. The Hebrew understanding before apocalypticism is that Yahweh's angel dwells among men and can take the form of man, but is not a man. It's very much like some passages in the Gospels where Yahshua has some form of deity. Yahshua is a divine holy man, but not God in person, come down and become like man, not a person becoming fully the substance of the creator of the universe. That really puts one into some logical dilemmas. If you really think it through in your mind, what it means if Jesus is God and God comes down that way and God is no longer in the heavenlies, that Jesus dies and God dies, and what about the raising if they're the same substance? We believe they've got the same person but not the same substance. That's more Hebraic thinking rather than men that came down from the skies as gods to walk among human beings and command them. That's a Gnostic way. The deity itself in those kinds of understandings is walking on earth as incarnated as a man, being killed, redeemed, that is, and then descending back into the sky. Well, there are some places in the New Testament that we could cite, and I think I did one on the notes there, where that kind of thinking is pretty prevalent. In the Gnostic stuff of Egypt, it's very prevalent in just about every book, say from the Nag Hammadi Coptic collection. Next, we go to a new vignette. We're going to go to Herodians. We're going through the preface of the New Testament Code. If you don't know the players, if you don't know the program, you're never going to be able to speculate what happens. Let's talk about Herodians. Herodians were Idumeans. Idumeans at one time were brought into the collective of people called Jews because Idumea was just south of Jerusalem, and the religion caught fire down there at one time or the other. But in the time of the first century, they were considered half Jews, not fully Jews, and Idumeans by and large didn't keep Torah, but Idumeans were on hand when the Jewish War broke out, and actually Revelation speaks to some extent of the Idumeans that came up to try to help the Zealots and Sicarii in Jerusalem fight off the Romans. And what happened there? There was a great earthquake. The city split in three, etc. That's all about Herodians. Especially Herodians with the surname Agrippa. Just for instance, we're going to talk about Agrippa for a while. That is King Agrippa and his family. The Agrippa Idumeans, half Jews, were named after Marcus Agrippa, who was not an Idumean or a Nabatean. Marcus Agrippa, that Eisenman has kind of an idea that the name Marcus became the name of that supposedly earliest gospel. That Mark took his name from Marcus Agrippa, and the family of Herods took the name Agrippa as well. This Agrippa, Marcus Agrippa, was a great general. He was a great favorite of Caesar Augustus or Octavian. He was the general that beat Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium. Herodians at that time always had two names, maybe three names at times. These Idumeans were brought up in the luxury of Rome. They were brought up in palaces. I'm talking about all the Herods. After Antipater, the Herod that worked for Rome and worked his way up, and from him came Herod the Great, and then all the different sons, most of which were murdered by Herod the Great himself, and the offsprings of his sister Salome, of which Paul was one of them. They were brought up in Rome, in the temple, with emperors, because they were important to the empire, because Idumea was a territory that was very specifically and well located in order to keep control of the entire place that we call the Holy Land, Syria. Especially Herod Agrippa. As a youth, he was friends with the Emperor Caligula. They were really good buddies, took trips together and did leisurely things together. And you can look up Caligula, you'll find quite an insane guy there. Became emperor because he was able to smother Tiberius, the former emperor, and his uncle, after being abused, sexually abused, for years and years on the Isle of Goats, the Isle of Capri. The Agrippas, the Herod Agrippas, Agrippa number 1 and Agrippa number 2, historically had very close connections with Egypt. We're still talking about Egypt. There was a huge contingency of Jews and soon after Christians in Egypt. Again, it seemed like there was a lot more affluence in Egypt, and there was also a temple of Yahweh in Egypt, the Orion temple, which I'm talking about on my lectures on Melchizedek. It started last week. We'll do it again Friday. I'm going to talk everything, Melchizedek, everything I know, which is a lot. I've studied him for a long time, trying to debunk some of these teachings on Melchizedek now that are nothing but hindering believers in their faith and turning them back to Christianity. So the important connections here between the Herod Agrippas and the contingency of Jews in Egypt and their philosophical leaders, which Egypt itself later on was nearly wiped out by the Messianic movement. That is, in Trajan's time, about 117 AD, there was a big Christian revolt there. They'd been treated so bad by both Jews and pagans that the Christians raised themselves up and started burning down the city. This is, again, in the time of the Emperor Trajan. I've got a link to him there, too. Nearly wiped out everybody. Seems like Eisenman's making a connection here with the gospel, especially Marcus Agrippa, with all the Agrippas, and an Egyptian triumvirate that had unforeseen consequences of internecine strife between Egyptians with different beliefs and war, and finally the destruction of Alexandria and its library up there. Egypt was a prolific manufacturer of gospel-type literature, a home from which came the Gospel of Judas, of course, the Gospel of Thomas, that is Judas Thomas. Remember what I'm talking about when I say Judas. We're talking about Jews in particular. Gospel of Mary Magdalene, Mary the Mother, the Gospel of Philip, etc., etc. Egypt was also the venue of Vespasian, the emperor. He lived in Alexandria. Vespasian was the conqueror of Palestine, as you remember, from 66 to 69 AD. When he got called up, 69 was the year of 4 emperors in Rome, when Rome was burning the same time Jerusalem was burning. Civil war going on. Vespasian went back from Israel to Egypt, there in Alexandria, and he from there took back Rome with his particular troops before he went back to Rome for good as emperor. And that's where we begin the Flavian dynasty. So we have Vespasian on the throne now as the emperor. After 4 emperors died in the course of 1 year in the civil wars, and we have left behind Flavius Titus, who's the general under his father, left in Israel to destroy Jerusalem. This Flavian dynasty was the first dynasty to be able to take over the Julio-Claudian dynasty that had, well, it started with actually Julius Caesar, and after that Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero. Nero was the last. Then Vespasian, after the 4 died in the same year. Vespasian, the conqueror of Israel, the father of the dynasty that took over from the Julio-Claudians, and the father of Titus Flavius, the destroyer of Jerusalem, and his insane brother Domitian, who took over after Titus. You remember after Vespasian, that Flavius Vespasian died after 10 years' reign in 79 AD, the same year as John, if you're still there, Vesuvius. Titus takes over. His brother Domitian had no part in the war in Israel. Domitian was always held back in order to keep him from danger, so that if his dynasty continued on, if Vespasian and Titus would die in the war, they'd always have Domitian to go on the throne, so he was always kept back. Domitian finally came in after he supposedly killed his brother in the strangest way you can imagine. Vespasian dying in 79, Titus assuming the throne, along with Josephus, who was there. Titus, after a year and a half, caught the flu, and his brother heard that there was a new cure for the flu, and that was to fill a coffin full of ice and snow and get in there with it, as long as you could stand it. So Titus gets into this coffin that his brother fixes up for him, and Domitian then simply nails it shut. What a way to go. Domitian started then in about, that'd be about 71 AD, and he went on to the end of the century. Domitian considered himself to be the moral agent of the entire Roman world. He was the worshiper of a goddess named Minerva. It was his intention to make Minerva the goddess of the entire Roman Empire, and he worked very hard at that. In fact, he persecuted especially Christians and Nazarenes and Jews because they would not give up their faith, whereas most Romans, of course, that was part of the Roman pantheon, and they were happy to do that. We find some Bible characters that were killed by Domitian. One was Epaphroditus, who's found in Philippians chapter 4, I think. Paul leaves Epaphroditus. He's sick. He asks everyone to pray for Epaphroditus, or Epaphras, they're the same person, who was a secretary for Nero and continued on through the Vespasian dynasty to Domitian. Domitian finally got rid of him under false pretenses, maybe. Epaphroditus, as you recall, was secretary of Paul. And as the secretary for Nero, when Nero was cornered in the palace and snuck out the back door, he went to Epaphroditus' house, and Epaphroditus helped him to commit suicide, if that's what happened. Then 30 years later, under Domitian, Epaphroditus was then convicted of assassinating Nero. Well, they knew it all along. Finally, Domitian catches up with him because primarily he was anti-Minerva believer. Also in his reign, Domitian murders his cousin, who we should know. His name was Flavius Clemens, the same person known as Clement of Rome, the same as the protagonist in the Nazarene Acts of the Apostles, a cousin of Domitian. He, that is Flavius Clemens, and his wife Domitilla. Flavius Clemens was executed. Domitilla got him back, working with a guy that was a valet for Domitian, that is Stephanos. Strangely enough, his name was Stephanos. They worked together, and they knifed Nero in his own bed, or knifed Domitian in his own bedroom, and that was the end of the dynasty right there. So Domitilla, that is Clement's wife, was able to come back out of the exile that she was in. correspond with Stephanos, Domitian's valet, and be a part of his assassination. If he wouldn't have been assassinated, he would have probably destroyed all belief on earth. Now, if we want to go a little farther with that, we can go to Revelation, because in Revelation, we have specifically Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. I think that's in Revelation 17. The sixth head on the beast is Vespasian. The seventh head, who was to stay just a little while, is Titus. And the eighth head, who belonged to the seventh, his brother, and goes to perdition through the hand of Christians, that's Domitian. And he's given the number 8. He is an eighth that belongs to the seventh. And with a little trick of arithmetic that was used quite often at that time, the 8 is factorialized twice and becomes 666. So they considered Nero and Domitian as Nero redivivus, that is, come back from the dead. They were both understood to be 666 beasts. Let's see, where am I? Domitian was one also, you might remember, that brought up the relatives of Yahshua, blood relatives, that is, the grandsons of his brother Yehuda, Jude, to look them over and see what was going on with their kingdom. And of course, these were rough farmers back in Palestine, and Domitian looked at their hands and saw that they were hard workers and they had just a little bit of land to make their living off of, and they did it by farming. And Domitian called them simpletons and sent them home. Brought them clear to Rome from Palestine just to interrogate them. Trajan did the same thing around 117, but at that time, he didn't let them go, because in the meantime, they had become leaders of the Nazarene Ebionite movement in Palestine, and Trajan had to crucify him. So that was the end of the family of Jude anyway. Again, we have that name Jude. Judas. Everything hails back to what Eisenman says about Judas. Now, let's see. And we have this prolific historian, another Flavian. At least he adopted that name. That's Josephus, who after the war, you know his story, I don't want to get into it, but after the war, he was adopted as a son and ward of Flavius Vespasian, because when he was captured during the war, that is Josephus, he was, according to his writings, a general and the governor of Galilee at this time. He came from a priestly family. He was in line to be the high priest of this usurping priesthood that was in Jerusalem. And he was in Yotapata when the Roman armies, legions came. Yotapata, he put up walls and dug holes and held out for a number of days that he prophesied they would hold out. Josephus was something of a prophet. What was it, 49 days they held out, and they wounded Vespasian, the general, during the whole time with a rock, hit him in the leg, hurt him, so Vespasian was going to get in there one way or the other, and he did, and wiped out the town. But found Josephus down in a sewer in the town, tried to get him to come up. He wouldn't come up. Finally, he made a deal. He did come up after there was a mass suicide down in the hole. Josephus, of course, talks about him being the only survivor. He comes up and he says, look, Your Highness, we have a prophecy in Judaism of a star, somebody that comes out of our country to rule the entire world. Josephus says, Vespasian, you are that star. You will rule the world. Keep me alive right now. Keep me alive until we see if that prophecy comes true or not. So Josephus goes into prison and is used as an interpreter when Titus takes over after Vespasian leaves. And Vespasian, of course, is going back to Alexandria in Egypt to go back to Rome once Rome is cleared out, and Vespasian becomes the new emperor. And he hails Josephus as a prophet. These guys were really superstitious. If you read their or listen to their histories in Tacitus and Suetonius, they're always looking for omens and prophecies. Well, here we have one from Josephus. So Josephus is hailed a true prophet because indeed Vespasian comes out of Israel to become the ruler of the world. And all of a sudden, Josephus comes out of chains and bonds after interpreting Titus's orders and making speeches to those who are inside Jerusalem, inside the walls, trying to get them to come out. And he goes back to Rome. Who did? Who did a series? Did a few series. Yeah, he comes back to Rome as a ward and taking the ring of Vespasian and protected from the Jews because he was absolutely hated as a traitor. His whole life he wrote on behalf of the Flavians, and the Jewish war in Greek anyway was very favorable to Titus, almost as though Josephus worshipped Titus, the one who he interpreted for while they were destroying Jerusalem. Now, what do they call that? Stockholm Syndrome? I'm not sure. Begin to worship the one who's your captor. And so Josephus stays with the Vespasians clear through the rest of the dynasty to Domitian. And in the days of Domitian, nobody knows what happened to him. He just disappeared. But in the 90s AD, he wrote the Jewish Antiquities, the story of Judaism from the Bible, the whole thing. And of course, 30 years before, he wrote the Jewish War. Before he wrote it in Greek for the Romans, he wrote it in Aramaic for Jews. Quite a bit different. We don't have that Aramaic anymore, except we have excerpts from it in the Slovenian language. Slavonic Josephus, it's called. And of course, the historians and a lot of theological scholars say that this isn't really Josephus, but you read it and you know he's written his first account of the war to the Jews in the dispersion that is much different than he wrote with the Greeks and Romans later on. Talks all about John the Baptist. Talks about the Messianic movement in the Slavonic Josephus. I have a lot of theories about this that, of course, they're on jspresents.org. Look up Slavonic Josephus. I read it to you, and it's quite outstanding. All right, let me continue on. I'm on page 5. We've got 2 more to do. So we have Josephus merely worshiping Titus. Page 6. Here's something interesting that Robert points out in his book. The story of Ben-Hur. You know the story. Charlton Heston did the movie. It was a big novel for many years, bestseller. It's follows very closely the life of Josephus. Josephus wrote a work called Vita, or Vita in Latin, V-I-T-A, pronounced Vita. It means life. He's writing his life story. Mostly what it is, an apology for his working. Maybe not even an apology, more like making excuses for his work with the Romans against Jerusalem. Well, you see, he was a prince. Josephus is a prince. He was the heir to the high priesthood. I believe his father, whose name was Matityahu, he was a high priest. Some say he was either the Gospel Matthew, Matit, or his son. That's one theory. Because, of course, Matityahu, the disciple and apostle, he went to Alexandria, according to tradition. So Josephus is a prince of the temple. Josephus is captured by the Romans. He goes into slavery for a time. Then he gains favor when he saves the life of the captain of the ship, Marcus Arius. There's Marcus again. When the ship is destroyed in a battle. Ben-Hur, Judah Ben-Hur, he becomes all of a sudden the young Arius, puts on the ring of the Roman senator and can now have anything he wants up from slavery, as Booker T. Washington might say. So we've got Josephus his life goes right along with that. I think I kind of consolidated the two right there. Josephus goes into slavery. He becomes, well, in a way, he saves Vespasian by giving him this prophecy of rulership. And then Josephus wears the ring. Only Judah Ben-Hur came back and challenged Rome in the great chariot race, one of the greatest scenes in film. Josephus never did that. If he'd set his foot in Alexandria or Palestine again, he would have been assassinated for sure. That Balaam prophecy, a star. Remember the star prophecy? You can look it up. At the same time, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, a famous Talmudic figure, did the same thing. He held Vespasian as the fulfillment of the star prophecy and encouraged Vespasian to go and take the imperial throne by force. Remember, Vespasian was not a royal. He was not a royal. He was a mule salesman in England. Think about that. He'd been a general up in England there for a while under Claudius, but he was discharged from his commission because at one of Nero's thespian performances that sometimes lasted 8 or 10 hours, Vespasian fell asleep. So Nero picked him out. Instead of killing him, Nero dropped his military commission. He was in debt his whole life up until he became emperor, trying to sell mules. Crazy, no? Now he's the emperor. He's back in the chips again because of the Balaam prophecy. Maybe he is the fulfillment. I guess if Rabbi Ben Zakkai and the priest Josephus say yes, maybe he is. He was also encouraged to do so by Philo through his New Testament nephew, mentioned in the New Testament, not by name, Tiberius Alexander. I think that they call him in the Acts the governor. Josephus, of course, Agrippa II, Agrippa I, what a story he has. So interesting. He died in about 44. Remember, he's in Acts. He wears a a golden outfit that the sun's shining off, and they hail Agrippa as a god. And he says, I am a god, something like that. And then he gets sick and dies. Well, there was something to that story. It's more like the story of Herod the Great, but Agrippa himself, he had the grip, definitely. He was agripped after a speech there in the Capitol, coming out, making a speech. He got such a, what we used to call the grip, bowel problems, stomach flu, that kind of thing. And spent 5 days in agony and died. Like, he'd only reigned a couple of years. And it was a 17-year-old son that took over, Agrippa II, but he was not considered smart enough to take over the kingship. So he was kind of the Roman liege for a while to see what he could do. Now, that family, it's an incredible family. Agrippa I, he was in debt all his life, running from debt. He was extremely generous. His wife actually called and begged her rich friends to help him out. And finally, he decides to go up to, maybe I'm going too long on this. Well, I just don't have a little more left. Agrippa decides, I'm going to go up to Tiberius and see if that he will straighten out my debt, pay my debt, and then I'll be in debt to Tiberius. Of course, Agrippa grew up in the palace, so he knew Tiberius, the Caesar. But as I mentioned before, he was also the great friend of Caligula, Tiberius' nephew. And during the time when Tiberius took Caligula to the Isle of Capri and was molesting him all the time. And so back in those days, Agrippa took a little bit of a carriage ride with Caligula, and Agrippa said something like, it'll really be something that will benefit both of us when you put the pillow to the face of Tiberius and you, the heir, become emperor. Well, see, the carriage driver heard that, went and told Tiberius. So here we've got Agrippa years later coming up to Tiberius to ask him to resolve his debt. Tiberius puts him in jail for life. What happened then was there was an Essene in that jail. You know the story? A blind Essene. And he comes up to Agrippa in jail, who's used to luxury all his life. You don't get anything in those jails. And this Essene comes up and he says, I know who you are, to Agrippa. And I have a prophecy for you. He said, what do you want to hear first, the good or the bad? Agrippa says, tell me the good first. He says, you're going to get out of this prison by royal decree and become the king of all Israel. He says, what's the bad? This is a blind man. He says, you see that owl up in the tree? The blind man could hear the owl. Agrippa says, yeah, what about it? The blind man says, the next time you see that owl, you'll be dead afterwards. Okay, that was a story. Agrippa just laughed it off. Then Caligula does put the pillow to Tiberius' face and becomes the emperor, and immediately he not only forgives all Agrippa's debts, but he makes him king of Judea, just like boom, just like that. And he's king for a couple of years. Then the owl comes. According again to Josephus, the owl comes. Agrippa sees the owl, and he dies of the grip. What a story. The rest of the family. Agrippa II, his son, I told you he comes to power at 17 in about 44 AD. He has these sisters. I'm not out of the book. This is all in the book. This is all in the book. One is Bernice. We might say Bernice. Bernice. She's the model of the prostitute, something like the whore of Babylon. Bernice was a sister of Agrippa II, as I said. And she was also the mistress of Vespasian, son Titus. So Titus is married back in Rome, and he's down here in Jerusalem fooling around with Berenice, King Agrippa II's sister, whom King Agrippa had incestuous relationships with. When Titus becomes emperor, Berenice sneaks up to Rome to be with Titus, to be the empress. But Titus escorts her out, sends her back to Syria. And I wonder a lot of times about the name Titus in the Gospels, and there's got to be something to that. So let's see, I got one more page. Every one of these kids of Agrippa has a story. Agrippa II, Berenice, Mariamne, and Drusilla. Maybe we'll take a little bit of a look at a couple of the other ones. Seems like King Agrippa I, the same one that was let out of prison by Caligula, he made some messianic claims, and certainly the Acts tells us that he did. And most importantly, as he passed through Egypt, according to the historian, when he was let out of prison there in Alexandria, and by the time he gets back to Judea, the word goes out that Agrippa is going to be the Messiah, being freed from prison. And they get an idea of Isaiah 53, of course, the suffering servant, now being exalted. So he comes back, and there are messianic expectations, but of course he dies just right off the bat. Okay, I've already covered that. We skip now, as Robert does, to Philo and the Herodians to finish up. Philo was the philosophical interpreter of Judaism in Egypt. He's called Philo Judaeus, and his works are voluminous, and they make sense of a number of the Bible conundrums, but always from a Hellenistic viewpoint. You want to read about angels? Philo is great. You'll really like that because he understands all these bodies to be living creatures along with the earth, living creatures. He'd be great as a speaker at Earth Day. And all the family of Philo was enmeshed with the Herodian family as well. Besides Bernice's tryst with Titus and with her brother Agrippa II, other sister Mariamne gallivanted from one man to another. In one case, always rich. In one case, she was married, I can't remember to who, but somebody of the equestrian order, somebody fairly wealthy, and somebody else wanted her. And she said, I will marry you if you get circumcised. So he gets circumcised, Mariamne, or maybe Drusilla, I can't remember which, or Bernice, I can't remember which, marries him for money now that he's circumcised. Somebody with more money comes along and wants to marry her. And immediately after the circumcision, after the marriage, she leaves and goes to the more rich. I'm thinking it was Drusilla because we see her in the Acts along with her sisters and brother, talking to the Apostle Paul, who is a Herodian himself. He's the grandson of Salome, the sister of Herod the Great, according to the genealogy and according to what Josephus has to say. She marries the governor Felix. He was a wretched monster. He's in the Bible, you know, in Acts again, Felix. Felix means happy. Who did he followed? Festus. Festus means festive. All these despotic governors had real happy names. Felix died, of course. And Drusilla went on to marry the temple treasurer. And how can you get anybody richer than that? Well, she leaves the temple treasurer, I can't remember his name, and she marries the albarch of Alexandria. Brings her back to Egypt now. He's the richest man in the world. More Egyptian connections, funny names, substitutes, pseudonyms, aliases. And finally, we're going to look really quick at more on Philo. I'm following his order, although I'm adding stuff to that, and then we're done. Going back to Egypt, we have descriptions by Philo of the Therapeutai and the Essenes. When we talk about Essenes, we're not talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls variety. That's a different bunch. Those are zealot, Sicarii, very violent people. From what Philo writes about the Therapeutai, or healers, and the Essenes, really, he's probably got the best testimony. And certainly, he hails these people above all in Judaism. And we want to try to emulate them. I have on my site, again, the writings and recitations of Philo concerning the Therapeutai and Essenes, and let me tell you, they're worth following. Their self-abrogating lifestyle is not unlike a sect of Greeks called the Pythagoreans. Same garb they wore, the white linen. Interestingly enough, priests wore white linen. It's because these Essenes, so-called, though they never called themselves that, they called themselves Hoseans, which means those doers of the Torah. They were of a priestly class, the class of the Zadokite priests during the Davidic dynasty that were usurped in the priesthood by appointed priests by Herod. And they left Jerusalem altogether and the temple system, and they went into Syria to wilderness camps, and they went into Egypt and built a temple and a model of Jerusalem in Egypt there in Alexandria, Heliopolis, as per the prophecy in Isaiah chapter 19. Okay. And especially the garb of the high priest. This is all code language, Eisenman says, that the white linen robes were somehow, in a literary sense, connected with the high priesthood. That is, the Herodian high priests. Paul's Herodian connections were overt, and they were familial, as I mentioned. And his teaching, look at Galatians 3:23 sometime, were very much in line with the Herodian point of view. Let the Herods come in. You know the stories about Herod Agrippa building a porch off of his palace so he could see into the temple and watch the sacrifices and bring his heathen friends in to watch the sacrifices over there, and the zealots built a wall in the temple so Herod could no longer see. Herod wanted to be included in that because he was a Torah observer, Agrippa the First. But they wanted nothing of him or his foreign friends. Now, while Jesus in the Gospels is portrayed as a wine-bibbing drunkard, eating with tax farmers, eating with sinners, cavorting with whores, and thus certainly not keeping koshers or observing commandments or Sabbaths, someone like John the Baptist or even James, that is a Herodian Jesus that's been portrayed in these Pauline redactions of the Gospels. The redactions are so obvious, like when it says in parentheses that this is when he proclaimed all meats clean or all food clean. Obviously, that is a parenthetical a phrase put in by some redactor, undoubtedly a Pauline Christian. He was certainly not holy from the womb, or not portrayed that way, or even a vegetarian. Yet none of these things have anything to do with the historical Jesus, says Robert Eisenman, because he maintains, and we end with this, as you know, that if you want to find anything about the historical Jesus, there's nothing to know. But the closest you can get is the historical James. And he considers the Epistle of James to be authentic. And if we look at the Epistle of James and we look at some of the special material put in by Matthew, it is so similar. And he's right in this. You found the historical James, which he has in his previous book, James, the brother of Jesus. Then you found the historical Jesus. I'm going to look at the texts here real quick, see if there's anything there. Oh, look, I did a series on Nero. Plenty. Nero and Paul caused the Great Tribulation. I think I pretty well proved that. Don't you think, Allison? I got everything on the download site, 600 hours now. If you want a real laugh, read The Lives of the 12 Caesars by Suetonius. I think you can get that for a penny these days. All right. Any other comments or questions? Hello? Well, thank you for coming. Yahweh be with you till we meet again next week at this time for this class.